I was 14 years old back then, the age when most kids in suburban America start to be trusted by their parents to stay home alone overnight. New England in the autumn always carries a very peaceful beauty, with roads covered in vibrant red maple leaves. But that was also the time when small towns easily sank into a terrifying silence as darkness fell. The neighborhood where my family lived had always been considered one of the safest areas in the region. The crime rate here was nearly zero, and surrounding families rarely had the habit of locking their doors tightly when going out. That exact feeling of absolute, somewhat careless safety was the very thing that almost cost me my life. That day was a busy weekend when my parents had to go to a close friend's wedding all the way in another state. They were going to stay overnight and could not make it back in time, so they left me $50 on the kitchen counter to order food for myself. Our house was a fairly spacious two-story home, surrounded by a large yard filled with overgrown grass and big trees losing their leaves for the season. Before stepping into the car to set off, my dad told me to drag an old oak cabinet with broken drawers out to the curb. Dad said to do that so the heavy trash collection truck could easily pick it up on Monday morning. I obediently followed my dad's instructions in the late afternoon, just as the sun completely vanished behind the distant ridges of trees. After pushing the heavy cabinet into the right spot, I went back inside, only latching the main door loosely before heading straight up to my bedroom. I turned on my Xbox console, put on my headset, and began to enjoy my absolute freedom without any adult supervision. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, as hunger pangs began to hit, I paused my game to go downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. I happened to look through the glass window facing the street and noticed something unusual. An old, battered pickup truck with dark blue paint peeling off in patches was pulling up right next to my family's old oak cabinet. A tall man stepped down from the cabin, wearing a worn, tattered denim jacket with a baseball cap pulled low over the top half of his face. He did not immediately load the cabinet onto his truck, like ordinary scrap collectors usually do. Instead, he began to walk slowly around my yard, then stopped to pick up an old leaf rake that my dad had forgotten, and left leaning against the maple tree. Feeling that this person's actions were crossing the line a bit, I stepped out onto the front porch to ask him what he was doing. Hearing the noise, he whipped around to look straight at me, his eyes narrowing under the brim of his hat in intense scrutiny. He spoke in a raspy, incredibly slow voice, asking, "Are your parents home? I want to ask for some extra wood scraps in the shed." My self-defense instincts as a kid home alone kicked in instantly, so I lied and said that my dad was sleeping inside the house and told him to just take the cabinet away. The man said nothing more. He just silently nodded and turned around to lift the oak cabinet onto the bed of his pickup truck. The loud, dry roar of the truck's engine sputtered to life as it slowly disappeared behind the hill at the end of the empty street. I breathed a sigh of relief, went back inside, and carefully locked the main door tightly before heading back upstairs. I tried to push that man's grim face and prying eyes out of my mind by putting my headset back on to play games. The laughter of my friends through the microphone made the space of the large house feel a little less empty and cold. However, a seed of suspicion and unease had begun to sprout and linger deep down inside me from that moment on. I wondered why he had intentionally peered deep into my living room when asking that probing question. Time kept slipping away, and the digital clock on my desk suddenly jumped to 1 o'clock in the morning. The entire neighborhood by then had sunk into complete darkness, and not a single streetlight could reach all the way into my bedroom. The moment I turned off my gaming console and took the headset off my head, the surrounding space suddenly returned to a deathly silence. The room became so quiet that I could clearly hear the wind whistling through the glass window slits and the rustling of dry leaves outside in the yard. Suddenly, from the top of the street, I heard that very familiar engine rumble heading toward my house again. It was the sputtering sound of an old broken engine and the creaking of a truck with one dead headlight slowly crawling into the driveway. My heart instantly tightened, and I stood up from my chair to gently part the window curtains and look down at the curb. The blood in my veins turned to ice when I recognized it was the exact same pickup truck belonging to the scrap collector from earlier that evening. The truck parked right where he had taken the oak cabinet, but this time, the driver had absolutely no intention of turning off the engine. He stepped down from the cabin, his footsteps incredibly light and deliberate on the carpet of dry leaves scattered across the yard. His hand held a large flashlight, and he began to shine the blinding white beam of light directly into the ground floor glass windows. The beam swept back and forth continuously from the dining room to the living room, and then he abruptly stopped right at the large window. The man pressed his grim face flat against the glass pane, cupping his hands by his temples to try and see through the darkness into the house. Terrified, I backed away, trying to control my breathing and avoid making even the slightest noise, not even the rustling of my clothes. But he did not stop there. He began to move from the living room window around to the side door of the house. The sound of loud, frantic pounding on the door echoed right after, accompanied by a whispered call that slipped through the cracks of the door incredibly clearly. He spoke in that raspy voice, saying, "Hey kid, I know you're still in there. Open up so I can grab the rest of those extra things." Extreme fear made my head spin, and I knew I was absolutely not allowed to open that door under these circumstances. I dropped flat onto the floor, crawling as slowly and quietly as possible toward my parents' bedroom at the far end of the second-floor hallway. That was the only place in the house with a landline telephone so I could contact the outside world. I picked up the receiver and dialed my mom's cell phone number, and she answered after a few rings in a sleepy voice. I held back my tears and whispered into the receiver, "Mom, the scrap guy from earlier is back, and he's trying to break through the door to get inside." Hearing my words over the phone, my mom woke up completely, her voice instantly turning into pure panic. She screamed into the phone, telling me to find a way to hide inside the large closet immediately and lock the bedroom door tightly. Meanwhile, on the other end of the line, I could hear my dad using another phone to make an emergency call to 911. Just as I lowered the receiver to do exactly what my mom said, a sharp, piercing snap suddenly echoed from the ground floor. It was the sound of the kitchen window glass shattering into pieces, raining down onto the ceramic tile floor with a bone-chilling ring. The safety boundary of the house was completely shattered as that man reached his hand through the broken glass to turn the latch and open the back door. The heavy, slow thud of leather boots began to move across the wooden floor of the first floor. I heard the sound of the kitchen drawers being pulled open with a rough rustle, as if he were rummaging around looking for something, or a sharp weapon. Those terrifying footsteps began to leave the kitchen and headed toward the wooden staircase leading up to the second floor. Each step creaked in a steady, deliberate rhythm, proving that he was taking his time walking up to where I was hiding. I knew I had no time left to crawl into the closet, so I dropped flat, squeezing myself into the gap under my parents' bed. I clamped both hands tightly over my mouth, tears streaming down my face from fear, my ears straining to catch the slightest movement outside. The footsteps stopped right in front of my parents' master bedroom door, where I was lying completely frozen inside. The metal doorknob suddenly twisted violently, clicking back and forth several times, but it wouldn't open because I had managed to lock it tightly beforehand. A suffocating silence engulfed the space. The man did not bang on the door or use force to break his way in. He just stood there completely still in the hallway, and then I watched in horror as a beam of flashlight crept through the gap under the door, sweeping back and forth across the room. Then came a soft tap against the wood of the door, 3 distinct cold knocks echoing into the room. He pressed his face close to the door crack and whispered in that raspy voice, "Your parents' bed looks pretty spacious, doesn't it?" Making my entire body go completely numb with horror. Right at that moment, the frantic wail of police sirens echoed from the top of the neighborhood, shattering the thick, heavy air of pressure. I heard the footsteps outside the hallway suddenly rush headlong back down the stairs, the back door slamming shut, and the pickup truck's engine roaring as it sped away into the night. 3 police officers burst into the house. They found me trembling under the bed and safely brought me outside. At the scene, the police confirmed that the kitchen window glass had been smashed, and on top of the dining table on the ground floor, he had left the leaf rake taken from my yard earlier that evening as a clear threat. The next morning, my parents rushed back home. They immediately installed a dense security camera system and never left me home alone again. The police did conduct a search for the pickup truck based on my description, but there were hundreds of those old, unregistered vehicles in this area, and that man completely vanished without a trace. Years have passed, and that old oak cabinet from that year has probably been sold or burned to ashes, but I still cannot forget those 3 soft knocks on the door late at night. Whenever I hear an old truck engine sputtering into the night, I can't help but wonder if he really just wanted to find old junk, or if he is still lurking in some neighborhood somewhere, waiting for another child to be left all alone. I'm a remote software engineer, a job that allows me the freedom to travel and live exactly how I want. A few months ago, I decided to treat myself to a brand new Tesla. To me, the car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of convenience, modernity, and absolute safety. I was especially proud of the car's smart security system, featuring surround view surveillance cameras and a real-time 3D object scanning radar display. Because of my flexible freelance schedule, I often made a habit of driving through the night across the North American desert states to find creative inspiration in the absolute silence. My wife is currently back home in the town of Elko, Nevada. Whenever I started a night journey, she and I always stayed in touch over the phone so she could rest easy and I would have some peace of mind. However, the price of this freedom was that the stretches of highway cutting through the Nevada desert were always breathtakingly desolate. The supercharger stations in this region were spaced incredibly far apart. Cell service was spotty at best, and the surroundings were nothing but dirt, rocks, and tumbleweeds rolling with the wind, completely devoid of any help should something go wrong. That night, the dashboard clock read exactly 11:45 p.m. The car's system began emitting warning chimes as the battery level dropped to a critical threshold. The navigation map forced me to pull into an old, dilapidated supercharger station sitting on the edge of a ghost town. Abandoned since the gold rush days, the surroundings were pitch black with no streetlights whatsoever, except for the dim, blurry blue LED light from the charging stalls reflecting off my dusty windshield. I plugged in the charging cable, quickly stepped back into the warm cabin, and turned on the relaxation mode to wait. Yet, the moment I leaned back into my seat, a strange, ice-cold shiver suddenly ran down my spine. My intuition told me that something was terribly wrong. The space outside was so utterly still that there wasn't even the sound of a single insect, or the wind whistling through the door seals, creating a suffocating atmosphere. I had a sickening feeling that countless eyes from the dilapidated, abandoned houses across the street were staring dead at me through the dark tinted windows. I was looking down, scrolling through my phone to kill time, when the Tesla's central touchscreen suddenly started flickering. Right after that, the 3D object scanning radar system automatically activated. This was a feature that normally only worked to detect pedestrians or obstacles when the car was moving. But right now, my car was sitting completely still. On the screen, a gray, human-shaped glowing figure unexpectedly appeared in a dark corner of the lot, about 10 meters away from my car. The figure stood perfectly still for a few seconds, and then abruptly vanished from the scanning range. My heart rate began to skyrocket, pounding wildly inside my chest. I quickly looked up, straining my eyes to peer out the car window, but the surroundings were pitch black. No one was there, and not a single sound could be heard. I forced myself to swallow hard, trying to reassure myself that this was definitely just a minor software glitch, or at worst, a stray dog running across the empty lot. I gripped the steering wheel tightly with both hands, fighting the urge to shake to keep my composure, and decided not to call my wife because I didn't want to worry her for no reason. However, that self-deception didn't last long when the car screen suddenly let out a short, sharp. The gray human figure reappeared on the radar, but this time, it was no longer far away. It was standing right against the rear of my car. I startled, looking straight up at the digital rearview mirror display, through the crisp camera feed. I watched in sheer horror as a tall, gaunt man in a ragged, filthy hoodie stood right there. Most of his face was concealed in the shadows of his hood, but his pearly white teeth were fully exposed, twisted into a wide, deranged grin. In his hand, he held a long screwdriver, and he slowly raised his arm, beginning to tap it lightly and rhythmically against my car's taillight. The hollow thud, thud, thud sounds vibrated through the metal frame of the vehicle, echoing inside the quiet cabin as clearly as a hammer striking my ears. I froze, my entire body locking up as I realized this was absolutely not a system glitch or a figment of my imagination. A real, flesh-and-blood psycho was standing right behind me, and he was deliberately playing with me, sickishly terrorizing my mind. In a state of sheer panic, I frantically tapped the emergency roadside assistance button right on the central touchscreen. After a few long rings, the system connected me to a night shift dispatcher at the operations center. I tried to keep my voice low and urgent, rushing to explain the dangerous situation and begging for help. The dispatcher quickly checked my car's GPS coordinates, and went silent for a few seconds. His voice suddenly turned grave as he informed me that this abandoned supercharger station had a few prior reports involving a psychotic transient who specialized in stalking people, charging their cars at night to extort or rob them. He said he was immediately notifying the local police, but the nearest station to this ghost town was over 40 miles of desert road away. That meant it would take the officers at least 45 minutes just to reach my location. Just as I was about to ask for more details, the network signal suddenly wavered. A loud static hiss cut through the line, and the call dropped completely due to the weak reception. The terrifying silence enveloped me once again, leaving me all alone with utter helplessness and dread inside the lonely cabin. Right then, the hollow tapping at the back of the car abruptly stopped. The 3D radar scanning screen flickered again, and the gray human figure began to move slowly around my vehicle. The smart sensor system kept drawing a perfect circle, tracing the entire frame of the car with every single step he took. Then he stopped right outside the driver's side window where I was sitting. He pressed his face, covered in a web of deep, filthy scars, flat against the dark-tinted window of the Tesla. His eyes were wide open, his pupils dilated without blinking even once, staring directly at my position, even though it was incredibly hard to see inside from the exterior. His lips missed and moved continuously, muttering incoherent, manic words that I couldn't make out at all through the thick glass. This horrifying nightmare dragged on for over 20 minutes. He would walk around, stop, and scrape his fingernails against the glass with a sickening scratch, sound like a wild predator hunting its prey. The car that was once my safe, high-tech sanctuary now felt like nothing more than a glass cage, torturing my sanity. Cold sweat poured off me in buckets, completely soaking the back of my shirt, even though the car's AC was still blowing out blasts of freezing air. I glanced at my phone screen only to find that the signal bars had completely vanished, cutting off any hope of contacting the outside world. At the same time, the Tesla's display notified me that the battery charge had reached 80%, an amount of power more than enough for me to step on the gas and escape this wasteland. However, there was a brutal reality. The thick supercharger cable was still plugged firmly into the charging port at the rear of the car from the outside. The car's smart locking system would absolutely not allow the vehicle to shift into drive if the charging gun hadn't been pulled out. If I wanted to survive, I had no choice but to open the door, step outside, and face that psychotic killer head-on to rip the cable out. Trembling, I looked down at the storage compartment in the center armrest, desperate to find anything that could be used as a weapon. The only thing I had right now was a long, heavy alloy flashlight that I usually used for checking the car at night. I gripped the body of the flashlight tightly, holding onto it like a final lifeline, my heart racing wildly inside my chest. Suddenly, a dry, metallic clank echoed from underneath the car, accompanied by a slight shudder. The man was crouching down, using the screwdriver to pry at the undercarriage, or deliberately cut the digital wiring harness to completely disable the car. This escalating action felt like a bucket of ice water dumped over my head, forcing me into a corner where I could no longer cowardly hide inside the cabin. Right at the moment I was about to push the car door open, the entire LED lighting and central touchscreen of the Tesla suddenly went pitch black. The automatic door locks let out a resounding clack and popped wide open. It seemed the maniac outside had managed to hit the emergency power cut switch, located inside the wheel well or underneath the chassis. With no more time to hesitate, I used every ounce of strength to kick the driver's door open and stepped outside, my right hand raising the alloy flashlight high. The night desert wind rushed directly at me, bringing a bone-chilling cold and the heavy scent of dust and sand. The man had now stood straight up, moving right in front of my car under the dim desert moonlight. The twisted grin on his filthy face stretched even wider, all the way to his ears, exposing his teeth at a distance so close it made it hard to breathe. His right hand was gripping the sharp screwdriver, the metal tip gleaming threateningly in the dark. The two of us stood facing each other with less than 2 meters between us, the air growing so thick it felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. All of a sudden, the madman let out a spine-chilling shriek and lunged straight at me with terrifying speed. I didn't have time to think anymore. I screamed at the top of my lungs for courage, and, putting the entire weight of my body into the swing, smashed the alloy flashlight directly into his face. The blow from the full force of my body connected, making a dry smack sound that echoed through the quiet space. The madman stumbled back a few steps and collapsed onto the dirt and sand, the screwdriver flying out of his hand and sinking into the darkness. Without wasting a single precious second, I whipped around and rushed straight to the rear of the car. I used all my strength to rip the supercharger gun out of the charging port and slammed it onto the ground. I dove back into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and hit the emergency start button just as the central screen powered back up. I threw the car into reverse and slammed the gas pedal to the floor, causing the car to roar as the tires spun wildly, kicking up dirt, rocks, and sand directly at the man who was just pushing himself up outside. Through the rearview mirror, I watched the man slowly stand up straight from the swirling cloud of dust. He made no attempt to chase after me. He just stood perfectly still, watching the car lights fade into the distance. He slowly raised his gaunt hand and waved to me in a sickening, eerie manner before retreating and vanishing completely into the deep shadows of the abandoned ghost town. The Tesla tore down the deserted highway at breakneck speed, leaving the horrific danger far behind my back. I made it back to my house in Elko just as the sky was beginning to break dawn, my entire body still shaking uncontrollably after the night's horrors. I immediately went to the police station to report the entire incident and provided the exact coordinates of the charging station. A few days later, the local police got back to me, saying they had gone to inspect the scene but found no one there, except for a few dried bloodstains left on the dirt and sand. Weeks have passed, and my life has gradually returned to its normal, everyday rhythm. However, the ultimate dread of that night has never truly vanished from my mind. Whenever I have to sit alone in my car at night, I absolutely never dare to look at the 3D object scanning radar display again. The most terrifying lingering aftermath is that every time the smart system accidentally renders a random gray figure on the screen while I'm driving, my heart stops out of pure fear. I am constantly haunted by the thought that the desert madman, with that twisted grin, is standing right outside the window, silently staring dead at me from the darkness. Long-haul truckers in America are not afraid of ghosts. We are only afraid of desolate roads without any headlights. This happened in the middle of July 2023. That was the time when the central states of the US had to suffer from brutal peak heat waves. I still maintained my routine of driving at night through dark and arid country roads. I usually turned on AM radio to listen to country music to stay awake amidst the dead silence. It was a normal trip just like thousands of my other trips. But the event that night left an invisible obsession that lasts until now. Since that trip, I never dare to look into the rearview mirror whenever I drive through the desert at night. The incident did not involve blood or monsters jumping out to attack. But the anomalous cold in the middle of that summer night is something that will never fade from my mind. That night, I was accompanied by a team driver named Miller. We, two middle-aged men, had over a decade of experience gripping the crete steering wheel of 18-wheelers. The goal of the trip was to pick up an expedited load from a private cold storage facility in the suburbs of Chicago. We had to deliver the cargo to Denver before the holiday for a payout 3 times higher than usual. The truck had to run along the Interstate 80 highway right through the state of Nebraska. It was an absolutely flat and barren strip of land. The gas stations here were 100 miles apart, and cell service flickered with every gust of desert wind. Right from the moment we picked up the cargo, I noticed unusual signs from the cold storage manager. When signing the dispatch sheet, his face was pale and his hands were shaking noticeably. He constantly checked the latches of the rear container as if he was afraid of something getting in or escaping. Before the truck rolled out, the manager looked straight into my eyes and gave a strange warning. Keep the reefer temperature at -20 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the trip. Absolutely do not turn off the cooling system even for a single minute. And if you hear any noises from the back, just hit the gas and run, do not stop. The incident triggered at around 2:45 a.m. By then, Miller was fast asleep on the bunk bed behind the cabin. I was still straining my eyes. Driving through the pitch-black desert night, the space outside was so silent that the only sound left was the tires grinding steadily on the asphalt. Suddenly, a strange noise broke the silence. It was a long, dragging screech that sounded like metal being clawed. Right after that came 3 steady, dull thuds. Thump, 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 coming from the back. That sound echoed from the 53-foot container right behind my back. It repeated once more right at the partition between the cabin and the cargo area. It was absolutely not the sound of metal contracting due to the cold. It sounded exactly like a hand wrapped in thick cloth punching hard against the truck wall. I shuddered, looking into the rearview mirror to search for any abnormality. But the giant white trailer remained completely motionless in the dark. Fear began to brew, making it impossible for me to sit still. I quickly shook Miller awake to confirm if I was mishearing things. Miller woke up groggy and muttered an annoyed curse. But right at that moment, a heavy thud abruptly echoed once again. This time, the sound shifted from the partition down straight under the floorboard. The impact was violent enough to shake our seats. Both of us froze, looking at each other, realizing that something very real was out there. Miller tried to find ordinary explanations to reassure himself. Maybe a piece of blown tire tread is slapping against the undercarriage, or a wild animal got caught in the axle while we were driving through that empty stretch. But right after that, the digital control panel on the dashboard suddenly flashed continuously. The truck's temperature sensor started blaring a red alert. The temperature inside the cargo area had jumped from minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 32 degrees Fahrenheit in just a few minutes. This was completely absurd because the cooling unit was still running at full blast. The artificial cold inside was being warmed up in an anomalous way by something. The two of us decided to step up our defense by locking all the cabin doors. Miller pulled out his Colt .45 pistol, holding it ready with a tense look on his face. I slowed down and pulled the truck into an abandoned rest area by the roadside. The place had no lights and was completely isolated from the outside world. When the truck came to a complete stop, the desert fell into a terrifying silence. The mysterious thumping from earlier vanished entirely. Now only the "oh" humming of the cooling unit's fan remained. Miller and I grabbed our flashlights and stepped out of the truck to walk around to the back to check. As we approached the container doors, we immediately discovered a piece of physical evidence. The frost clinging to the metal latches of the trailer door had completely melted into water. And there were streaks of dark liquid, looking like body fluids, leaking from the edge of the rear door. A pungent, foul stench wafted up, forcing both of us to step back in sheer disgust. We made a deadly mistake because of the complacency of old truckers. The massive contract penalty if the cargo was ruined made us hesitate. Instead of calling for a tow, the two of us decided to open the latch ourselves to check the cooling system of the trailer. The atmosphere shifted into total silence under the suffocating heat of the desert summer night. Miller tightly gripped his pistol, standing guard around the perimeter with a look full of anxiety. I tremblingly yanked the heavy iron bar to unlock the container doors. Immediately, a blast of freezing cold air from the inside rushed out straight into my face. It carried an indescribable foul stench, exactly like the smell of frozen meat left for too long and turning bad. The danger had now advanced deep into our safe zone. I lifted my flashlight, sweeping it around the tightly packed cargo. Right before our eyes, the pallets in the middle had been violently ripped open. The thick layers of plastic wrap were completely clawed to shreds from the inside. A bizarre sign appeared, making my scalp go numb. Amidst those destroyed cargo pallets, a large empty space emerged. The styrofoam boxes packed with ice had been dug up haphazardly, creating the distinct shape of a human body curling up, but the entity that left that mark was no longer in that position. The level of threat escalated to the absolute limit when a new sound echoed. We heard a wheezing, heavy breathing sound coming from the darkest space at the very end of the container. That spot lay far beyond the reach of the light my flashlight could cast. That exact moment made every single reason to stay completely collapse within me. As I beamed the light straight down onto the floor, I saw bare footprints printed crystal clear. They were footprints stained with that dark fluid, frozen solid onto the metal floorboards, and those footprints did not lead outside the doors at all. They were heading backward from the end of the container, walking straight toward the doors where Miller and I were standing. "Look up there!" Miller abruptly screamed in pure panic. I whipped my eyes up, following his flashlight beam, and realized the inside latch of the auxiliary escape door had been busted open. That was the small hatch leading straight from the cargo area onto the roof of our truck cabin. There was no more room for argument. The sheer survival instinct took over our entire minds. The two of us slammed the container doors shut as hard as we could, without even taking the time to lock the iron security bar behind. We bolted headlong straight into the cabin. I cranked the key to start the engine and slammed my foot on the gas, sending the 18-wheeler hurtling back onto the highway. We left behind all of our personal belongings that had scattered across the ground of that abandoned rest area. The truck was running at 70 miles per hour through the dark. The cramped cabin space became suffocating and intensely tense. Even though the air conditioning was running at full blast, an anomalous chill still crept in from behind. That cold did not belong to machinery. It was the cold of death. The climax began when I glanced at the rearview mirror inside the cabin. The mirror reflected a silhouette through the small window, connecting to the sleeper berth right behind our backs. Someone was sitting on Miller's bunk bed. I was completely paralyzed, keeping my eyes glued to the desert road ahead. My two hands shook uncontrollably on the giant steering wheel. Meanwhile, Miller slowly turned his head to look toward the darkness of the sleeper berth. Under the dim dashboard lights of the cabin, everything appeared like a living nightmare. A pale hand with fingertips turned purple from the freezing cold reached out from the darkness. It placed gently on Miller's shoulder. The face of that entity slowly revealed itself completely before our eyes. His facial skin was shriveled due to frostbite, and those eyes with no pupils were staring blankly at both of us. He opened his mouth, exhaling a gust of freezing air pungent with the stench of decay. In pure panic, Miller screamed and fired his pistol wildly into the darkness. The deafening gunshots inside the tight space made me jerk the steering wheel. The 18-wheeler swerved, swayed violently, and almost flipped over on the road. I gritted my teeth and slammed on the brakes, forcing the truck to a halt right against the highway median. After the truck came to a complete stop, the gunfire ceased, and that entity had vanished through the ventilation hatch. Terrified, the two of us bolted out of the truck and ran for nearly 2 miles on the asphalt, which was still hot from the summer night. We ran for our lives until we encountered a Nebraska State Trooper patrol car. When we were brought to the nearest county sheriff's office, the old sheriff took one look at our ragged, panicked state. He was not surprised at all when he heard us talk about the truck left behind on the highway. The explanation that followed revealed a part of the horrifying truth behind this load. The sheriff leaned close to our ears and spoke in a low, secretive voice. He stated that the private cold storage facility in Chicago was actually an illegal transit point for a body smuggling ring. They transported corpses to serve underground medical experiments, or to deep freeze the bodies of gang members. The sheriff further revealed that just last week, a faulty thaw had occurred at that exact warehouse. A few specimens, thought to have been long dead, suddenly showed signs of muscle contraction and vanished before our truck rolled out. The officer's attitude was highly evasive, clearly wanting to hush up the matter and control the information. He quickly seized our delivery manifest along with our dispatch sheets. He demanded that we sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding everything that happened tonight in exchange for our freedom. Miller and I were released by the police the following morning. The 18-wheeler and the refrigerated container had already been towed away by an unknown entity since dawn. The entire expedited shipment was canceled without any official explanation. The hefty payout promised at the beginning was never transferred into our accounts. When I tried to call back the cold storage manager in the suburbs of Chicago, the system only indicated that the number did not exist. The close professional relationship between Miller and me also completely shattered after that horrific night. Miller decided to sell his share of the semi-truck to me within that same month. He moved his home to warm Florida and swore never to step foot on another truck for the rest of his life. I still stuck with the long-haul trucking job because it was the only source of livelihood for my family, but I absolutely never accept any overnight cross-state loads alone again. And I always flatly refuse any cargo units requiring deep freeze temperatures, no matter how high the payout might be. Currently, I am sitting in a familiar roadside diner at midnight, I look out at the massive truck stop parking lot, which is being covered in the thick mist of a late summer night. Every time I hear the reefer units of the trailers parked nearby kick in and start clattering, my heart skips a beat. The true identity of the man inside that cold trailer that night remains an open-ended question in the darkness of Nebraska. Whether he was a walking corpse due to a faulty thaw or an anomalous entity we had never known before. I do not have the answer, and perhaps I never want to know the exact answer either. I only know for sure that the thing is still wandering somewhere out there on Interstate 80. It is hiding inside some refrigerated container out there to escape the suffocating heat of the summer. And I know he still vividly remembers that touch on Miller's trembling shoulder that night.